Alright, in the next section of Chapter 8, we're still talking about factoring, but this time we're going to factor trinomials, so things with 3 terms. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to factor trinomials with a leading coefficient of 1 and factor weirds with a leading coefficient of 1. And what I mean by that is we're going to have trinomials, so 3 things, like x squared plus 3x plus 2. The leading coefficient is this number right here, and every one that we're going to do today, your leading coefficient should be 1. So, in order to do that, we need to think about some numbers. You're going to be asked today to find numbers that do 2 things. They need to add to a certain number and multiply to another number. So chances are these ones will be a little easy for you to come up with. 2 numbers that add to 7 and multiply to 12. I'm going to draw something like this that chances are you've seen before in your math classes. I want 2 numbers that add to make 7 and multiply to make 12. So you can go through, I always come up with the multiplying first. So things that multiply to make 12 are 2 and 6, or I have 3 and 4, or I have 1 and 12, and that's it. So some combination of these have to add to make 7, and chances are you're way ahead of me and you already know that it's going to be 3 and 4. Now these numbers here are going to be the important numbers that we're going to use today. They obviously get a little bit harder when we throw some negatives in there, but we can do the same thing. I want 2 numbers this time that add to make 1 and multiply to make negative 90. So because they multiply to make a negative number, I know one of them has to be positive and one of them has to be negative. And because they add up to 1, I know that this number, the positive one, has to be bigger, but they have to be relatively close together. So chances are popping in your brain right now are 9 and 10. In order to make this happen where they add to positive 1, I need to make this a positive 10 and this a negative 9. Last one, I want 2 numbers. Wasn't big enough. 2 numbers. This time they got to add to make negative 15 and multiply to make 50. So stop and think about what you know about numbers. If they're multiplying to make a positive number but adding up to a negative, that means they both need to be negative. And then remember, if you get stuck, always think about numbers that multiply to 50, because there's literally infinite possibilities to add to negative 15. And 5 and 10, chances are coming in your head, and we're going to use those. Both of them going to be negative. So let's put that to work. Remember when we multiplied things like this out, we would double distribute. So I would take x, and I would multiply it by x to give me x squared. I'd take x and multiply it by 2. And then I would take 10, negative 10, and multiply it by x. And negative 10 and multiply it by 2. And then we would always combine like terms. So we'd end up with this. Remember, factoring is going backwards, and we're literally going to follow these steps backwards. We're going to break this up into 2 different terms, and then once we have 4 terms, we can factor by grouping. So if I asked you to factor this, basically what you're doing is you are trying to find numbers that we can split that up into. Now the thing that's weird is I could split this up into a ton of different possibilities. I could split it up into this, because this would still simplify to negative 8x. I could split it up into this, positive, whoa, go back, 100x minus 108x minus 20. But there's only one way that we want to split this up, and we want to split it up in a way that when I factor by grouping, I get the same numbers inside of the parentheses like we did yesterday. Now if I do it either of these ways, I am not going to get the same thing in parentheses. So what we have to ask ourselves is the same question we were asking before. What 2 numbers add to make that negative 8 and multiply to make negative 20? And those numbers are the numbers we see over here. It's going to be a positive 2 and a negative 10. And that's what we're going to use to split this up. And then we're going to factor by grouping. So just like we did before, I can take out an x, Here I can take out a negative 10. And now, because I picked those numbers correctly, both of them have an x plus 2 in there. And we end up with exactly what we started with over here. So the whole thing that we did before, we're finding the two numbers, are going to come in handy because that's what we are going to use to split up our middle term. So let's try another one. I want two numbers. They have to add to make that number in the middle, that's 7, and multiply to make the number on the end, which is 10. So go through your multiples of 10. 1 and 10, those do not add to 7, but 2 and 5 do. And because they're both positive, it doesn't matter which one I put first. And remember, that's what we're going to use to split this up. So it's going to become g squared plus 2g plus 5g plus 10. Now remember, we're not changing anything. All we're doing is breaking up this middle term so that I have 4 terms, because if I have 4 terms, then I can factor by grouping. And hopefully now the factoring by grouping you're getting pretty good at. Practice makes better with this, just like everything else in math class, so the more you do, the better you're going to get. Let's do this last one. I need to break this up. So I need to find two numbers. They need to add to make that 13, and they got to multiply to make 30. So go through your multiples of 30. You got 1 and 3, or 1 and 30, sorry. Those don't add to 13. So then you got 2 and 15. Now those subtract to 13, but there's no negative in here, so we don't want that. 3 and 10, those will add to what we need, so those are what we're going to use. So now you rewrite this and break this up into 3a plus 10a plus 30, and then group it up. So these guys have an a in common, and I'm left with a plus 3. These guys have a 10 in common, and I'm left with a plus 3. So because the a plus 3 is the same, I can factor that out, and I'm left with a plus 10. So now, the next 2 days, we're going to do things that are a little weird. If you notice in the next couple slides, we have weird cases. There's 1, 2, and 3. These are weird just because they look a little different, but your process is exactly the same. So the first weird case we're going to do has 2 variables on it. So if you notice, this has an x squared, your n term has a y squared, and in the middle, we have 1x and 1y. I want you to totally forget about that for a second and just do what we've been doing. Find 2 numbers, and they need to add to make the number in the middle, so 11, and multiply to make the number on the end, so 24. So go through things that multiply to make 24. You got 1 and 24, those don't work. 2 and 12, those don't work. 3 and 8, that'll do the trick. And now remember, the goal of this is to split this guy up. So the x squared stays exactly the same, but now this is going to be 3xy plus 8xy, because that would combine to make 11xy, plus 24y squared. And now we just get to factor by grouping. So what do these 2 things have in common? Well, this guy has 2 x's and this guy has 1, so I can take one of those out. And I'm left with x plus 3y. And then over here, these guys have an 8 in common and a y in common, so I'm going to take that out. And I'm left with an x. I need a 3 to make 24 and 1 more y to make y squared. And remember, this is your check. I know I did it right because those 2 parentheses are the same. And the thing I have left over is x plus 8y. And I'm done. Weird case number 2 is the difference of 2 squares. Remember, difference means subtraction. 2 squares means both of these things are squared numbers. Now the only difference here is that there is no middle term. So you could think of this as x squared plus 0x minus 36. Or you could just jump the gun and say, I need 2 numbers They have to add to make nothing because there is no middle term, and they have to multiply to make negative 36. Now the thing about these, if they add to make nothing, it has to be the same number, but one's got to be positive and one's got to be negative. So the same number that multiplies to make 36 is 6 and 6. So just like before, I'm going to rewrite this middle term. X squared plus 6x minus 6x minus 36. Remember, these should turn it back into this, and those would cross off. So then you factor by grouping. These guys have an x in common, and I'm left with x plus 6. These guys have a negative 6, and I'm left with x plus 6. I know I did it right because my middle terms are the same. So you get x plus 6, and then what's left over is x minus 6. You're going to notice that every single time this happens, these two are going to look exactly the same, except one's going to be positive, one's going to be negative. All right, last weird one. This is called a perfect square trinomial, and you will see why when we're done. From the look of this, it looks totally normal. You're going to start off the problem exactly the same. You want to ask yourself what two numbers add to make the number in the middle and multiply to make the number on the end. So go through multiples of 16. You have 1 and 16, that doesn't work. 2 and 8, that doesn't work. 4 and 4, those will add up to 8. So this is what makes it weird, is those are the same number. So when you do this and break it up, you get this. When we factor by grouping, this will have an x in common, and I'm left with x plus 4. These guys have a 4 in common, and I'm left with x plus 4. And then if you notice, when I take out this x plus 4, the thing I have left is another x plus 4. And remember, mathematicians are lazy. We don't want to write more than we have to. So we're never going to write the same thing twice. Instead, what we're going to do is write it once and square it. So anytime it happens that these numbers are the same, you know your answer is going to look something like this. So if you like to memorize things, I would memorize these weird cases. If you don't like to memorize things, you do the problems exactly the same. Your answers just have a pattern to them. So I want you to try these 4 right here, and then those other ones that we left blank we'll do in class together as well. So make sure you write down any questions you have, and we can go over them later. Enjoy your night.